A wealthy CEO tried to humiliate the janitor at a board meeting. What the janitor did next shocked the executives. It was a Monday morning like any other at Everest Enterprises, a monolithic skyscraper that pierced the clouds in the heart of downtown. The building itself was an architectural marvel, sleek lines of steel and glass shimmering under the rising sun. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with the hum of high-stakes ambition. Employees in tailored suits and polished shoes rushed through the corridors, clutching laptops and balancing cups of coffee as they prepared for another demanding day. Everest wasn't just a workplace. It was a kingdom, and at the very top of it all sat Garrett Langston, the CEO. Garrett was a man whose presence could silence a room. His meticulously styled salt and pepper hair and sharp, custom-made suit reflected his reputation. Unyielding, efficient, and fiercely competitive. As he walked through the main lobby, his leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floors, conversations faltered and eyes followed him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Garrett wasn't known for small talk or smiles. He thrived on results, and he demanded perfection from everyone around him. On the far side of the lobby, a janitor knelt by a mop bucket, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain on the floor. He was a man in his late 40s, with a sturdy build and a quiet demeanor. His uniform, though clean and neatly pressed, bore the marks of his labor, faint traces of bleach and wear along the seams. His name tag read Samuel, but most employees hardly noticed him long enough to use it. Garrett, least of all. As Garrett approached the elevator bank, his sharp eyes caught sight of Samuel still scrubbing the floor. He stopped abruptly, his expression a mix of irritation and condescension. "Could you not do that in the middle of the day?" he asked, his tone clipped. "This is a professional environment." Samuel glanced up, his brown eyes calm but steady. "Spill was reported this morning." "Just finishing up," he replied, his voice measured. Garrett waved a dismissive hand. "Then finish it somewhere else. I've got executives coming in, and I don't need them seeing this." Samuel gave a short nod, stood, and wheeled his mop bucket away without another word. As Garrett stepped into the elevator, his reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors. His irritation lingered as the elevator whisked him upwards to the executive suite. The top floor of Everest Enterprises was a world apart. Plush carpets muffled footsteps, and sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating an opulent space designed to exude power and success. In the corner office, Garrett reviewed his agenda for the day. Meetings with the board, updates on the company's faltering tech division, and a critical pitch to secure a multi-million-dollar partnership. But the tension in the air was palpable. Everest Enterprises had been slipping. A failed acquisition the previous quarter had left the board uneasy, and whispers of dissatisfaction had started circulating. Garrett's sharp intuition told him that today's board meeting would be pivotal. His reputation, and perhaps even his position, was on the line. Meanwhile, Samuel made his way down to the basement, where the janitorial staff gathered during breaks. The break room was modest, with worn chairs and a coffee machine that sputtered more often than it worked. Samuel set down his mop bucket and pulled out a brown bag lunch from his locker. "Another day, another dollar," muttered Hector. A younger janitor slouched in a chair, scrolling on his phone. "Langston give you one of his speeches again?" Samuel shrugged. "Just doing my job." "Yeah, well, some of us have it worse," Hector replied. "He's been on a tear lately. You hear about Dan from accounting? Fired on the spot last week. No warning, nothing." Samuel listened quietly, his face unreadable. It wasn't the first time he'd heard stories about Garrett Langston's harshness, but he never commented. Words, he'd learned, could escalate situations unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on his work, staying in the background and observing. By mid-morning, Samuel was back on the 12th floor, tidying the conference rooms. Through the glass walls, he caught snippets of conversations. Executives in tailored suits huddled around sleek tables, their voices low but animated. Phrases like quarterly losses and board dissatisfaction floated in the air. Samuel's hands moved methodically as he wiped down the tables, but his ears were attuned to every word. He'd been at Everest Enterprises for nearly 2 years, long enough to learn the rhythms of the company and its people. The executives, with their calculated smiles and sharp tongues. The junior staff, eager yet anxious, desperate to climb the ladder. And Garrett Langston, the unrelenting force that kept them all in line. Samuel understood power dynamics better than most. He'd seen them play out before, in places far removed from janitorial closets and mop buckets. But those were stories he kept to himself. As lunchtime approached, the boardroom on the 18th floor filled with Everest's top brass. Garrett arrived last, his presence commanding attention. He took his seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the room like a general surveying his troops. "Let's get started," he said curtly. "We have a lot to cover." The meeting unfolded with a mix of sharp analysis and thinly veiled tension. Slides flicked across the screen, detailing missed targets and underwhelming performance metrics. Garrett's sharp comments cut through the air, keeping everyone on edge. But behind his composed facade, there was a flicker of unease. He knew the board's patience was wearing thin. Back in the corridors, Samuel continued his rounds. As he moved from floor to floor, his mind wandered. He thought of the morning's exchange with Garrett, the dismissive tone and the unspoken assumption of superiority. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But Samuel had learned long ago that patience often outlasted power. He paused by a window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to ambition and resilience. Samuel's reflection stared back at him, his uniform blending into the background. A faint smile tugged at his lips. There was a certain freedom in being overlooked, a power in being invisible. "Everyone has a role to play," he murmured to himself before turning back to his work. As the day progressed, the paths of the CEO and the janitor crossed once again, though neither could have foreseen the events that would soon unfold. For Garrett Langston, it was just another day of asserting dominance. For Samuel, it was another step in a long, deliberate journey. And for Everest Enterprises, it was the beginning of a story that no one in that gleaming skyscraper would ever forget. The sun hung high in the sky, its light piercing through the towering windows of Everest Enterprises' 18th floor. The boardroom gleamed with the sharp polish of wealth and power. The table, a long stretch of mahogany, flanked by chairs upholstered in supple leather, dominated the room. At the far end, an expansive screen displayed the company's latest performance metrics, a grim testament to Everest's recent struggles. Executives trickled in, their muted conversations carrying an undercurrent of tension. Some adjusted their ties. Others tapped nervously on their phones. At the head of the table sat Garrett Langston, a man whose presence seemed to draw all the oxygen from the room. His icy gaze swept across the attendees as if daring them to meet his eyes. "Let's begin," Garrett commanded, his voice cutting through the hum of chatter like a knife. The room fell silent. The first presentation came from Lauren, the senior financial analyst, a sharp-dressed woman whose confidence usually filled any space she entered. Today, though, her voice faltered slightly as she advanced the slides. Quarterly revenues were down, expenses had spiked, and market confidence had begun to waver. Words like decline and underperformance were etched into the data. Garrett leaned back in his chair, the creak of leather breaking the tense silence. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the table's edge as Lauren fumbled to finish. Finally, he spoke, his tone icy. "We're all aware of the problems, Lauren. What I'd like to hear is how you propose we fix them." Her cheeks flushed. We've identified key areas where cost-cutting, not enough," Garrett interrupted sharply. He leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Cutting costs doesn't drive growth. Where's the innovation? Where's the strategy to bring us back to the top?" An uncomfortable silence followed. Lauren sank into her chair as Garrett's gaze moved to the next presenter, signaling them to begin. One by one, the executives took their turns. Each presentation brought more excuses, more grim statistics. Garrett's patience thinned visibly. His interjections grew sharper, slicing through their defenses like a scalpel. In the hallway outside the boardroom, Samuel quietly wheeled his cleaning cart past the closed double doors. From inside, muffled voices rose and fell, occasionally punctuated by Garrett's commanding baritone. Samuel paused briefly to adjust his cart, his ears catching snippets of the meeting. $1 million shortfall in tech development. The board is demanding answers. He moved on, his expression unreadable. Years of working quietly in the background had taught Samuel the value of listening more than speaking. Words held power, but silence could often hold more. Back in the boardroom, tension reached a boiling point. Garrett's frustration was palpable as the final presenter wrapped up. The last slide on the screen displayed a dismal forecast for the next quarter. Garrett rose from his seat, his hands planted firmly on the table as he loomed over the room. "Enough," he said coldly. "Do you think this," he gestured to the screen, "is acceptable? Everest isn't a second-rate operation. Yet you stand here offering nothing but excuses and half-baked solutions." A nervous murmur rippled through the room. Garrett straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "If this is the best you can offer, maybe I've been too generous with your positions." The implied threat hung in the air like a guillotine. Eyes darted nervously. No one dared respond. Garrett's reputation for ruthlessness was well earned. The silence was broken by the clatter of a cleaning bucket outside the door. Garrett's head snapped toward the sound. "What the hell is that?" he barked. The door opened a fraction, and Samuel appeared, his mop and bucket in tow. He froze briefly under the weight of so many eyes, then cleared his throat. "Sorry, sir. Just cleaning," he said, his tone calm, almost apologetic. Garrett's lips curled into a sneer. "Of course. Come in, then. Might as well give us all a reminder of what failure looks like." Laughter rippled awkwardly among the executives. Samuel hesitated, but years of experience in swallowing indignity kicked in. He stepped inside and began mopping a coffee spill near the corner of the room. The air was thick with tension, the kind Samuel had grown accustomed to navigating. As he worked, Garrett continued to speak, his words now directed at the room, but clearly meant as another jab at Samuel. "You see, this is what happens when you lack ambition. When you settle for mediocrity." Samuel didn't look up, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. He finished the spill and moved toward the door, his steps measured. As he reached the exit, he paused, his hand resting on the frame. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice steady and just loud enough for the room to hear. "Ambition takes many forms, Mr. Langston. Sometimes it looks like climbing ladders. Other times it looks like building them." The room fell silent, the weight of Samuel's words lingering long after he left. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For a moment, the room's power dynamics had shifted, and everyone felt it. After the meeting adjourned, the executives filed out, their whispers echoing down the corridor. Garrett remained behind, staring out the massive windows that overlooked the city. His reflection stared back at him, hard and unyielding. Yet, in the back of his mind, Samuel's parting words gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. In the hallway, Samuel wheeled his cart back toward the elevator, his face calm but his eyes glinting with quiet resolve. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was the story. The crisp, professional air of Everest Enterprises' 18th floor was punctuated by murmurs from inside the boardroom as Samuel pushed his cleaning cart through the hallway. He worked steadily, his movements deliberate and practiced. Each sound from the meeting, a raised voice, the tap of a pen against the table, slipped under the crack of the door and into the corridor. Samuel knew better than to linger, but the tension was palpable even from the hallway. Inside the room, Garrett Langston's voice filled the space, sharper and colder with each passing moment. "This company is on the verge of falling behind," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do any of you actually understand what's at stake here?" The executives avoided his gaze, shuffling papers, their discomfort evident. Garrett didn't need to see their faces to know they were squirming. He thrived on moments like this. Control, power. These were the currencies he valued most. Suddenly, a soft knock at the boardroom door broke the flow of Garrett's reprimand. Heads turned as the door creaked open, and Samuel appeared, his mop bucket in tow. The faint squeak of the bucket's wheels on the polished floor cut through the room like a whisper in a cathedral. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice heavy with irritation. "Is this what our multi-million-dollar meetings have come to? Interruptions from the janitorial staff?" Samuel stopped in his tracks, his expression unreadable. He gave a small nod, his voice calm as he said, "Apologies, sir. I was told there was a spill that needed cleaning." The CEO's lips curled into a sneer. "A spill? Of course. Can't have our pristine boardroom sullied, can we? Come in, then. You're already here." The executives exchanged uneasy glances as Samuel moved toward the corner of the room where a small puddle of spilled coffee glistened on the mahogany floor. He knelt down, his movements unhurried, as if unaware of the tension crackling in the air around him. Garrett, however, was not one to let such an opportunity pass. He leaned back in his chair, addressing the room but clearly targeting Samuel. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the perfect example of why we must hold ourselves to higher standards. The world doesn't reward mediocrity. It doesn't care for excuses or failures. Just as this man's job is to clean up after our mistakes, we must ensure we don't make them in the first place." Laughter rippled through the room, nervous, tentative. No one dared to defy Garrett's lead. Samuel didn't react. His focus remained on the spill, his cloth moving methodically as he absorbed the liquid and wiped the surface clean. Garrett wasn't finished. "Tell me," he continued, his voice dripping with mock curiosity, "what does it feel like to spend your days cleaning up after people who actually make something of themselves?" Samuel straightened slowly, his task complete. He turned to face Garrett, his expression calm and steady, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I imagine it feels similar to dealing with messes in other lines of work," he said evenly. "The only difference is, mine gets cleaned up." The room fell into stunned silence. Garrett's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and the executives exchanged wide-eyed glances. Samuel met Garrett's gaze for a brief moment, then picked up his bucket and headed for the door. As he reached the threshold, Garrett's voice rang out again. "Wait." Samuel paused, glancing over his shoulder. Garrett gestured toward the empty coffee pot on the sideboard. "Since you're here, why don't you refill that?" The tension in the room spiked again. Some executives looked down at their notes, while others stared at the table, their discomfort palpable. Samuel remained still for a moment before giving a slight nod. "Of course." He crossed the room to the sideboard, taking the coffee pot in hand. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. Garrett's smirk returned as he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. But as Samuel poured the fresh coffee and replaced the pot, a shift occurred. He turned back toward the room, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His posture exuded calm control, a stark contrast to the tension-filled energy Garrett had injected into the space. "Thank you, Mr. Langston," Samuel said, his tone polite but firm. "If there's nothing else, I'll leave you all to your important work." For a moment, Garrett said nothing. Then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he said, "Go on." Then, Samuel exited the boardroom, the door clicking softly behind him. The silence inside the room was thick, heavy. Garrett's usual confidence seemed slightly dimmed, as though Samuel's quiet composure had disrupted the rhythm of his dominance. In the hallway, Samuel pushed his cart toward the elevator. His expression remained calm, but his thoughts swirled. He had seen men like Garrett before, men who thrived on power plays and public displays of superiority. They always believed they were untouchable, that their control over others was unshakable. Samuel had learned otherwise. As he stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind him, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The day wasn't over yet, and he had more to do. Sometimes, the most effective responses weren't loud or dramatic. Sometimes, they were quiet and deliberate, rippling outward in ways no one could predict. And in the boardroom, where the silence lingered like a shadow, the first of those ripples was beginning to form. The late afternoon sun filtered through the high-rise windows of Everest Enterprises, casting long, golden shadows across the polished floors. Samuel moved quietly through the corridors, his cleaning cart a familiar companion. The air in the building felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. His encounter with Garrett in the boardroom still lingered in his mind, but Samuel carried on with his work as if nothing had happened. Experience had taught him the value of patience, the power of letting moments simmer. He wheeled his cart into a quieter hallway, where framed photos of Everest's founders lined the walls. The images told a story of ambition and success, a timeline of triumphs that had built the company into what it was today. Samuel's gaze lingered on one particular photograph near the end of the row. It showed a young Garrett Langston, standing tall with the founding team. His confident grin and sharp suit were the same, but his eyes held a spark of something Samuel hadn't seen in him today, an eagerness, an unguarded energy. The clatter of hurried footsteps pulled Samuel from his thoughts. He turned to see a junior executive, Amanda, her name tag read, approaching him. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, her hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Her face carried a mix of apology and unease. "Mr. Samuel, right?" she asked, her voice low. Samuel nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you?" Amanda glanced over her shoulder, ensuring the hallway was empty. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened in the boardroom earlier. That was uncalled for." Samuel's expression didn't change, but he offered a polite nod. "No need to apologize. It's part of the job." Her brow furrowed. "It shouldn't be. The way Mr. Langston treated you. It's not right. And it's not the first time he's done something like this." Samuel leaned slightly against his cart, his interest piqued but his demeanor calm. "What makes you say that?" Amanda hesitated, biting her lip before speaking. "He's built his career on putting people down. Even the board. Some of them are afraid to speak up. He wasn't always like this, though. Back when he started, people said he was different." Samuel nodded slowly. He had already pieced together much of what Amanda was saying, but hearing it confirmed aloud added weight to his thoughts. "And you? Why are you telling me this?" She hesitated again, her hands fidgeting. "I don't know. I felt like someone should say something. What he said to you today, it crossed a line." Samuel gave her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate that, Amanda. But sometimes, it's better to let things play out." Her frown deepened. "But, trust me," Samuel said gently, his tone firm but kind. "Things have a way of working themselves out." Later that evening, the office had emptied out, leaving the building eerily quiet. Samuel made his way to the break room on the basement level. The familiar hum of the old vending machine and the faint smell of disinfectant greeted him. Hector, his younger colleague, was slouched in a chair, scrolling through his phone. "Long day?" Hector asked without looking up. "You could say that," Samuel replied, pulling a cup of coffee from the pot. He took a seat across from Hector, his movements deliberate. Hector finally looked up, studying Samuel's face. "You don't seem bothered. After what Langston pulled in there, I'd be pissed." Samuel shrugged. "No point in letting it get to me. People like him. They show their true colors sooner or later." Hector snorted. "Yeah, well, sooner would be nice. You think anyone in that boardroom has the guts to call him out?" Samuel sipped his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes, it's not about calling someone out. It's about waiting for the right moment." Hector frowned. "And what moment is that?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set his coffee down and leaned back in his chair. When they give themselves enough rope to hang with. The next day, Samuel arrived early, as he always did. The building was still waking up, the hallways quiet except for the occasional hum of the cleaning crew. Samuel passed the framed photos again on his way to the elevator. His gaze lingered on Garrett's younger self once more before he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 18th floor. As the doors opened, he noticed a group of executives huddled near the boardroom entrance. Their voices were low, urgent. Samuel walked past them, his steps slow, his ears attuned to their conversation. "Another deal slipping through our fingers. If this continues, the board is going to demand answers. Langston's not going to take the fall for this. He'll throw someone else under the bus before it gets to him." Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line as he wheeled his cart toward the nearby janitor's closet. He had heard enough to confirm what he already suspected. Cracks were forming in Garrett's carefully constructed facade, and like all cracks, they would only grow with time. By lunchtime, the tension in the office was palpable. Samuel noticed it in the hurried footsteps of the executives, the sharp whispers in the hallways. Even Garrett seemed more tightly wound than usual, his usual commanding presence edged with a flicker of uncertainty. As Samuel passed through the staff lounge, He caught sight of a worn book on one of the tables. The title, Leadership in Crisis, Strategies for Resilience, caught his eye. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. The passages on effective leadership and emotional intelligence brought a faint, ironic smile to his face. He placed the book back on the table and resumed his work. There was no rush. He had learned long ago that the key to winning battles wasn't speed, it was strategy. By the end of the day, Amanda found Samuel again, this time in the hallway near the elevators. Her expression was hesitant but determined. "Samuel," she said quietly, "if there's anything I can do, anything at all, just let me know." Samuel studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Amanda. I'll keep that in mind." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Samuel allowed himself a moment of reflection. The pieces were beginning to move, the groundwork quietly being laid. Garrett Langston's empire wasn't as unshakable as it appeared. And Samuel? He had no intention of staying in the shadows forever. The morning air in Everest Enterprises felt unusually heavy, as if the building itself sensed the unease bubbling within its walls. Samuel arrived early, as he always did, his steady footsteps echoing down the near-empty corridors. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone who understood his role, but also the power of observation. Today, however, he carried something with him that wasn't visible, a plan slowly taking shape in the back of his mind. The break room on the basement level was quiet when he entered, save for the faint hum of the vending machine. Hector was already there, sipping on a lukewarm soda and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up as Samuel walked in. "Morning," Hector mumbled. "Morning," Samuel replied, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting across from him. His movements were unhurried, calculated. Hector's eyes flicked toward him. "You seem focused. Got something on your mind?" Samuel sipped his coffee, his expression calm. Nothing out of the ordinary, but Hector wasn't convinced. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know what you've got planned, but whatever it is, be careful. People like Langston, they don't go down easy." Samuel met his gaze, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes they don't have to be taken down. Sometimes they do it themselves." Later that morning, Samuel was on the 15th floor, cleaning the windows of an unused office. The view from this height was breathtaking, the city stretching out in a mosaic of steel and glass. As he worked, he overheard voices from the adjacent room. The door was ajar, and the conversation carried clearly into the space. "You're telling me he hasn't reviewed the latest projections?" one voice said, laced with frustration. "No," another replied, exasperated. "He's been too busy micromanaging the tech team. And honestly, I don't think he even understands the data." Samuel paused, his hand resting on the window pane. The voices continued, the tone growing more urgent. "This can't go on. If the board finds out how unprepared he is, they'll demand a leadership change." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. He resumed cleaning, but his mind turned over the implications of what he'd just heard. The cracks in Garrett Langston's armor were becoming more apparent with each passing day. By lunchtime, Samuel found himself in the staff lounge. A group of younger employees were gathered around a table, discussing the company's latest struggles. Their voices were hushed, but the frustration was clear. "They're bleeding money on that tech project," one of them said. "And Langston's solution? Push harder. Like that's going to magically fix everything." Another chimed in. "I heard he's been dodging meetings with the board. If this deal falls through, it's on him." Samuel listened quietly as he sipped his coffee. He had no intention of joining the conversation, but the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The leadership vacuum was becoming increasingly obvious, and the tension among the employees was palpable. That evening, as the office began to empty out, Samuel made his way to the staff lounge again. He brought with him a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. He sat at a corner table, opened the notebook, and began writing. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the vending machine. After a while, Amanda entered, her expression tired but curious. She noticed Samuel at the table and hesitated before approaching. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Samuel gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Go ahead." She sat down, glancing at the open notebook. "What are you working on?" Samuel closed the notebook slightly, a faint smile on his face. "Just some thoughts. Ideas." Amanda leaned forward, her curiosity evident. "Ideas about what?" He studied her for a moment before replying. "Solutions. Everyone talks about problems, but not enough people think about solutions." Her brows furrowed. "You mean for the company?" Samuel nodded. "Everest has potential, but potential means nothing without direction." Amanda stared at him, her mind racing. You've really thought about this, haven't you?" Samuel's smile widened slightly. "I've been here long enough to see what works and what doesn't." Before Amanda could respond, the door opened and Hector walked in. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the two of them, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" Hector asked, his tone cautious. "Just talking," Samuel said simply, closing his notebook. Hector frowned but didn't push further. "Be careful," he muttered as he grabbed a soda from the vending machine. "This place has eyes everywhere." The next morning, Samuel arrived even earlier than usual. The office was nearly silent as he made his way to the 18th floor. He stopped outside the boardroom, where the remnants of yesterday's meeting still lingered. Empty coffee cups, crumpled papers, and a faint sense of unease in the air. Samuel entered the room and began cleaning. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he considered his next steps. The notebook in his bag felt heavier than usual, its contents brimming with ideas and strategies that could reshape Everest Enterprises. As he finished his work and wheeled his cart toward the door, he glanced back at the boardroom one last time. A faint smile crossed his face. Change was coming, and he was ready to be part of it. Samuel's quiet expertise had remained unnoticed for too long. But now, as the cracks in Garrett Langston's leadership widened, an opportunity was emerging, and Samuel, with his calm demeanor and unassuming presence, was poised to step into the light when the time was right. The office buzzed with an almost palpable tension as the week dragged on. The whispers about Everest Enterprises' faltering leadership had grown louder, seeping into every corner of the towering building. Executives exchanged hurried glances in hallways, junior staff kept their heads low, and even the janitorial staff, usually removed from corporate drama, felt the shift in the air. Samuel moved through the building with his usual quiet purpose, but there was something different about him now. His eyes lingered longer on conversations in passing, his hands steadier as he worked. The pieces of the puzzle were assembling themselves, and Samuel was preparing for the moment when the picture would become clear. In the boardroom, Garrett Langston sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming impatiently against the polished wood. The presentation on the screen behind him painted a grim picture. Red arrows pointing downward, bar graphs dipping precariously, and numbers that screamed failure. Garrett's jaw tightened as he stared down the senior executives seated around him. "This," Garrett said, his voice dangerously calm, "is unacceptable." No one dared to meet his gaze. The air in the room felt suffocating as Garrett's icy glare swept across the table. One executive, a wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose, finally spoke. "Mr. Langston, the projections aren't entirely out of our control. If we shift focus to—" Garrett slammed his hand on the table, silencing him. "Shifting focus is what got us here in the first place," he snapped. "What I want, what I need, are results. And if you can't deliver them, I'll find someone who can." The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "Dismissed," he said coldly. The executives filed out of the boardroom like chastised schoolchildren, their shoulders hunched and their faces pale. Garrett remained behind, staring at the grim projections on the screen. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Samuel watched the executives leave the boardroom as he pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway. Their hushed voices reached him in snippets. "If this keeps up, the board will have no choice but to intervene. Langston's losing his grip. He's too focused on blame to see the bigger picture." Samuel paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. He resumed his work, but his thoughts were sharp and focused. He had seen this kind of leadership before, fragile, reactive, and ultimately unsustainable. That evening, as the office emptied out, Samuel found himself in the staff lounge again. Hector was there, as usual, lounging in a chair with his feet propped up on the table. Amanda sat across from him, her arms crossed and her face tense. "You can feel it, can't you?" Hector said, his voice low. "This place is falling apart." Amanda nodded reluctantly. "Langston's under pressure, and it's showing. But what can we do? We're not exactly in a position to fix this." Samuel entered the room and poured himself a cup of coffee. He joined them at the table, his presence commanding a quiet respect despite his unassuming demeanor. "Sometimes," Samuel said, "the people who aren't in the spotlight see things more clearly than those who are." Amanda looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you saying?" Samuel took a sip of his coffee before replying. "I'm saying that change doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes, it starts with the people who know how things really work." Hector frowned. "You think we can change anything? We're not the ones with power." Samuel met his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Power isn't always about position. Sometimes it's about timing." The next morning, Garrett stood in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The sun cast a golden glow over the buildings, but Garrett's mood was anything but bright. He turned back to his desk, where a stack of reports awaited his attention. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Langston," she said hesitantly, "the board has requested a meeting. They want an update on the tech division's progress." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Tell them I'll address it at the next quarterly meeting. They insisted on speaking with you sooner," she added, her voice wavering. "They said it's urgent." Garrett waved her off, his frustration evident. "Fine. Schedule it." As she left the room, Garrett leaned against his desk, his hands gripping the edge. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, he felt it slipping out of his control. Samuel, meanwhile, had been quietly networking with the employees who made the company run. The engineers, the analysts, the support staff. He spoke to them during breaks, asking questions that seemed casual but were calculated. He learned about the problems plaguing the tech division, the missed deadlines, and the lack of clear leadership. And slowly, he began to connect the dots. One evening, as Samuel sat in the break room reviewing his notebook, Amanda approached him. She hesitated before sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about how change starts with the people who know how things really work." Samuel looked up, his expression thoughtful. "And?" She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you have a plan, I want to help." Samuel studied her for a moment before nodding. "It's not about plans," he said. "It's about timing. And the time is coming." Amanda nodded, her resolve clear. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger, something that could make a real difference. As the week progressed, the storm brewing within Everest Enterprises showed no signs of abating. Garrett Langston's grip on the company was weakening, and the cracks in his leadership were becoming impossible to ignore. And in the shadows, Samuel continued his quiet work, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The atmosphere at Everest Enterprises had shifted. Whispers of discontent filled the air, growing louder with each passing day. Meetings became battlegrounds of half-baked solutions and defensive postures, while Garrett Langston's increasingly erratic behavior only added fuel to the fire. The board was restless, the staff demoralized, and the company teetered on the edge of a full-blown crisis. Through it all, Samuel remained a steady presence, observing quietly from the periphery. The janitor with the unassuming demeanor and the sharp eyes had spent months piecing together the threads of Everest's unraveling tapestry. Now, the moment he had been waiting for was finally at hand. It began with an email. Sent anonymously to the board members, it outlined critical flaws in Everest's current strategy and provided a clear, actionable plan to address them. The document was meticulous, citing specific data points and offering innovative solutions that the company had desperately needed. Most striking of all, it was signed simply, an observer. The board was intrigued. The insights were too precise to ignore, too valuable to dismiss. Garrett, however, was livid. "Who the hell thinks they can go around me like this?" He fumed during an emergency meeting. "Whoever sent this thinks they're some kind of savior. Well, they're not." This company doesn't need anonymous critics. It needs leadership. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Evelyn, spoke up. Perhaps leadership should take the time to address these suggestions rather than dismiss them outright. This plan has merit, Garrett, and we owe it to the company to explore it. Garrett's jaw clenched, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Fine, he said curtly. Let's see if this so-called observer has the guts to come forward. The next day, a message was sent to the staff. An all-hands meeting had been scheduled for the following afternoon. The subject line read, "Rebuilding Everest, a path forward." The announcement sparked a flurry of speculation. Some believed Garrett was about to announce sweeping changes, perhaps even a resignation. Others feared another round of layoffs. Few noticed Samuel as he wheeled his cleaning cart through the office, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. The conference hall was packed by the time the meeting began. Garrett stood at the podium, his presence as commanding as ever, but there was an edge of desperation in his voice as he addressed the room. Everest Enterprises has faced challenges before, he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. And each time, we've overcome them because of our resilience, our innovation, and our commitment to excellence. Today, we take the first step toward reclaiming our place at the top. He gestured to the large screen behind him, where a slide deck illuminated the company's recent struggles and a vague outline of potential improvements. The room was silent, the audience waiting for something more substantial. Before Garrett could continue, the doors at the back of the hall opened, and all heads turned. Samuel entered, his posture straight and his expression calm. He carried a laptop in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he made his way to the stage. Garrett's face twisted in anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "This is a private meeting." Samuel climbed the steps to the stage, meeting Garrett's glare with an unflinching gaze. "I believe this meeting is about rebuilding Everest," he said, his voice steady. "And I have something to contribute." The room erupted in murmurs. Garrett looked as though he might explode, but Evelyn, seated in the front row, raised a hand to silence him. "Let him speak," she said firmly. Samuel approached the podium and placed his papers down. "For years, I've worked in the background of this company," he began. "I've seen its strengths and its flaws. I've seen what works and what doesn't. And I've seen leadership that prioritizes ego over excellence." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Garrett's face reddened, but he remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength. "Everest Enterprises doesn't need platitudes or empty promises. It needs direction. It needs solutions. And it needs to remember that every person in this building, from the board members to the janitors, contributes to its success." He turned to the screen and connected his laptop. A new presentation appeared, outlining a detailed plan to address Everest's challenges. The audience watched in stunned silence as Samuel walked them through each slide, his insights razor-sharp and his proposals bold yet practical. When he finished, the room was still. Then, Evelyn rose to her feet, her expression one of admiration and respect. "This," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "is the kind of leadership Everest needs." The applause began tentatively, then grew to a thunderous ovation. Garrett's face was a mask of fury and disbelief as he stormed off the stage, leaving Samuel standing at the podium, his composure unshaken. By the end of the day, the board had called an emergency session. Garrett's position as CEO was on shaky ground, and whispers of a leadership transition spread like wildfire. Samuel, however, declined any offers of promotion or recognition. "I'm not here to take over," he told Evelyn when she approached him after the meeting. "I just wanted to remind everyone what this company is capable of." Evelyn nodded, her respect for him deepening. "You've done more than that, Samuel. You've given us hope." As Samuel left the building that evening, the city skyline stretched out before him, bathed in the golden light of sunset. He walked with a quiet confidence, his role in Everest's transformation complete. The janitor who had been overlooked and underestimated had become the catalyst for change, and he carried the satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. The morning after the all-hands meeting, Everest Enterprises buzzed with a palpable sense of change. The usual stiffness and formality in the air had softened, replaced by cautious optimism. Employees who once shuffled past one another with their heads down now exchanged quiet smiles and whispered conversations. The tension that had gripped the company for months was finally easing. Samuel arrived early, as always, his movements deliberate and calm. He went about his usual tasks with the same quiet efficiency that had defined his time at Everest. But now, as he walked through the corridors, the glances he received from employees carried something new: recognition. In the boardroom, Garrett Langston sat alone, staring out at the city skyline. His reflection in the glass was stern and unyielding, but the man behind it was a shadow of his former self. The board's emergency session the previous evening had been the final blow. Evelyn and the other members had made their decision clear. Garrett's time as CEO was over. The door opened behind him, and Evelyn stepped inside. She closed the door softly and approached the table, her demeanor composed but firm. "It's time, Garrett," she said. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I built this company," he said quietly. "Everything Everest is today. It's because of me." Evelyn nodded. "And everything Everest can become will be because of the people who work here. That includes you, Garrett, but it doesn't mean you have to lead." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. The fight in him had waned, replaced by a reluctant acceptance. Without another word, he stood and walked past her, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. In the basement break room, Hector was pacing back and forth, his usual bravado replaced by nervous energy. "You think they'll really get rid of Langston?" he asked. Amanda, seated at the table, nodded. "It's already done. Evelyn's taking over as interim CEO." Hector stopped pacing and let out a low whistle. "Man, I never thought I'd see the day." The door opened and Samuel entered, his expression as calm as ever. He set his coffee down on the table and took a seat. "What's the mood upstairs?" Amanda asked. "Change is in the air," Samuel said simply. Hector sat down across from him, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really shook things up, didn't you? I mean, a janitor walking into a board meeting and telling them how to run the company? That's the kind of thing they make movies about." Samuel chuckled softly. "I didn't do it for the spectacle. I did it because it needed to be done." Amanda leaned forward, her gaze serious. "So what happens now? Are you going to stay on?" Samuel looked thoughtful for a moment. "I've done what I came here to do. Whether I stay or go, the work will continue. It's not about one person. It's about all of us." Later that day, Evelyn called a company-wide meeting. Standing at the same podium where Samuel had delivered his presentation, she addressed the staff with a quiet authority that commanded respect. "Everest Enterprises is entering a new chapter," she began, "and it's one that will be written by all of us. For too long, we've lost sight of what makes this company great: our people. It's time to change that." Her words were met with applause, and for the first time in months, the energy in the room felt hopeful. Evelyn's leadership promised a fresh start, and the employees were ready to embrace it. As the applause died down, Evelyn glanced toward the back of the room, where Samuel stood quietly, leaning against the wall. She gave him a small nod of gratitude, and he returned it with a faint smile. That evening, as the office emptied out, Samuel lingered by the framed photos in the hallway. His gaze settled on the picture of Garrett and the founding team. The youthful optimism in their faces a stark contrast to the struggles the company had endured. "Long day," a voice said behind him. Samuel turned to see Evelyn approaching, her expression warm. "You could say that," he replied. She stopped beside him, her eyes scanning the photos. "You've given this company a second chance, Samuel. Not many people can say they've done that." He shrugged lightly. "Sometimes it just takes a different perspective." Evelyn smiled. "Whatever your next step is, know that you'll always have a place here. Everest owes you that much." Samuel nodded, his gratitude unspoken but clear. "Thank you, Evelyn. But for now, I think it's time I moved on." She didn't try to dissuade him. Instead, she extended a hand. "Wherever you go, they'll be lucky to have you." He shook her hand, and with that, their paths diverged. As Samuel walked out of the Everest building for the last time, the city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like a million possibilities. He carried no resentment, no regret, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. For Garrett Langston, it was a time of reflection. For Evelyn and the employees of Everest, it was a time of renewal. And for Samuel, it was simply time to move forward, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, humility, and quiet strength. The janitor who had been overlooked and underestimated had become a beacon of what true leadership could look like. And though his time at Everest had come to an end, his journey was far from over.